If you think your silence is what hurts her the most, you may be misunderstanding the real power you hold. There is something far more unsettling than disappearing, and if you stay with me, you'll understand why this shift changes everything. Not just for her, but for you. I'm Mary Smith, and this is the Mindful Senior Living YouTube channel. And today, we're going to talk about something that most people get completely wrong in relationships, especially when emotions are involved, especially when distance enters the picture, and especially when you're left wondering what actually makes someone feel your absence in a meaningful way. And I want you to pause for a moment and be honest with yourself. Have you ever gone silent, thinking that your absence would finally make her realize your value? Have you ever stared at your phone, resisting the urge to reach out, telling yourself this is strength, this is discipline, this is how you win her back? If that's you, you're not alone. So many men, especially those who have loved deeply, fall into this pattern. And not because they're weak, but because they were never taught the difference between silence and self-possession. If this is already resonating with you, take a quiet second to like the video and subscribe. Not for me, but for the version of you that's ready to grow beyond reaction. Most men are taught that no contact is the ultimate move. You pull back, you vanish, you stop texting, stop calling, stop watching her stories. And yes, on the surface, silence creates space. Space creates curiosity. Curiosity can create longing. But silence by itself is still a reaction. And this is where things become uncomfortable. Because when you go silent, hoping she will notice, hoping she will feel something, hoping she will come back, you are still emotionally tied to her response. Your behavior may look controlled on the outside, but internally, there is movement, there is anticipation, there is waiting. And that waiting is what keeps you connected, even in absence. Let me give you a real-life example. I once worked with a man in his late 50s who had gone through a painful separation. He told me, "Mary, I haven't contacted her in 21 days. And when I asked him how he felt, he said, honestly, I check my phone every hour. Do you see what's happening here? His silence wasn't freedom, it was restraint. And restraint, when it's driven by hope or fear, is still a form of attachment. This is where we begin to understand something deeper. Stoicism was never about silence as a strategy. It was never about playing emotional chess. Stoicism is about emotional sovereignty. There is a difference between saying, I'm not speaking to you, and truly embodying, I no longer need to move in response to you. One is tactical, the other is transformational. When a man goes silent but remains emotionally reactive, a woman often senses it. Not because she is analyzing every detail, but because human beings are incredibly intuitive when it comes to emotional energy. If your silence carries tension, if it feels heavy, resentful, or performative, it creates a subtle pressure, and pressure invites resistance. It creates a push-pull dynamic that keeps both people emotionally entangled. But something entirely different happens when you become emotionally neutral. Not cold, not distant in a dramatic way, not pretending you don't care, but genuinely grounded, centered, and self-directed. When your silence is no longer about her, but about your own peace, the entire dynamic shifts. You are no longer withdrawing to provoke a reaction. You are recalibrating because you value yourself. And that is what unsettles someone. Because now she can no longer predict you. She can no longer feel that invisible emotional thread pulling toward her. And uncertainty, when it is calm and dignified, is far more powerful than silence driven by pain. Many men believe strength lies in withholding communication. But true strength lies in releasing emotional dependence. When you stop monitoring her behavior, when you stop crafting your actions to influence her reaction, when your life begins to expand beyond the storyline of us, something profound happens. You are no longer playing the game. You have stepped away from the board entirely. And here's the part most people miss. Silence can be broken, a message can be sent, a call can be made. But emotional self-containment, when it's rooted in self-respect, rewrites the entire connection. Because now your presence or absence is no longer a tactic. It's a reflection of who you've become. Think about it this way. When you were emotionally invested, even during silence, she could still feel your orientation toward her. She knew on some level that your emotional door was open, that awareness creates comfort. Even if she pulled away, she knew she could return. But when you close that door peacefully, without slamming it, Without announcing it, without trying to prove anything, she feels something different. Not the absence of conversation, but the absence of access. And that realization often lands heavier than silence ever could, because silence can mean I'm hurt. Emotional self-containment says I have moved forward. And those two messages create completely different emotional responses. There's a psychological concept called cognitive dissonance, where the mind struggles to reconcile conflicting information. When someone who was once emotionally available becomes calm, steady, and no longer reactive, it creates that internal friction. She may not say it out loud, but there is a quiet question forming. What changed? Why does he feel different? Why doesn't he seem reachable anymore? And this is not about manipulation. This is about growth. When you become emotionally anchored within yourself, you stop chasing reassurance. You stop interpreting her behavior as a reflection of your worth. You stop needing clarity from someone who is uncertain. And something powerful begins to happen inside you. Your nervous system starts to settle. Your thoughts slow down. You stop replaying conversations. You stop imagining different outcomes. You start living again. Let me share another story with you. A man in his early 60s once told me that after his divorce, he spent months trying to understand what went wrong. He analyzed every conversation, every moment, every mistake. And then one day, he made a quiet decision, not to figure her out, but to return to himself. He started walking every morning. He reconnected with old friends. He picked up hobbies he had abandoned years ago. And slowly, without even noticing, he stopped needing answers from her. That's the shift. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with a big announcement. It feels like coming home to yourself. And here's something important I want you to reflect on. When you practice no contact as a rule, you are still orienting your behavior around her. You are counting the days. You are watching the clock. You are wondering when she will reach out. That internal tension is not stoicism. It is suppressed attachment. Real stoicism is quieter. It doesn't feel like a performance. It feels like peace. And when you reach that place, something subtle but undeniable changes in your presence. If she reaches out, you respond calmly. If she doesn't, you remain steady. If she moves on, you do not collapse. If she hesitates, you do not chase. You are no longer attached to the outcome. And that, more than anything, is what creates real emotional impact. Because what often affects someone more than silence is witnessing someone they once influenced become unaffected. Not cold, not bitter, just no longer dependent. And let me be clear, this is not about becoming emotionally numb. It's about becoming emotionally disciplined. You still feel, you still care, but your feelings no longer control your direction. If you're still with me, I want you to think about this question deeply. Are you trying to make her feel something, or are you finally learning to feel something for yourself? Because that question changes everything. Most men spend their energy asking, how do I make her come back? But the more powerful question is, why was I willing to abandon myself in the process? When you shift your focus from her reaction to your own alignment, your behavior changes naturally. You stop over-explaining, you stop proving, you stop negotiating for consistency. Instead, you observe. You pay attention to patterns. You notice how you feel in someone's presence, and that awareness is not weakness, it is maturity. When you no longer try to control the narrative, you become grounded, and grounded men are rare, not because they are incapable, but because they were never taught that strength can be quiet. They were taught to pursue, to fix, to prove. But very few were taught to step back and ask, is this connection actually right for me? And when you begin asking that question, everything shifts. Because now, your time, your energy, and your attention become valuable. Not something you give away freely in hopes of being chosen, but something that is shared with intention. And when a woman senses that, she understands something without you saying a word. She understands that access to you is no longer automatic. It is earned through consistency, and consistency requires character. That realization can be deeply unsettling. Not because it hurts her ego, but because it highlights something real, something steady, something permanent. And here's the truth that many men only understand much later. The goal was never to make her miss you. The goal was to become the man who no longer abandons himself. When you reach that point, something incredible happens. Your life expands, your identity strengthens, your peace becomes non-negotiable. And even if she never comes back, even if she never realizes your value, you still win. Because you didn't allow heartbreak to turn you bitter. You allowed it to refine you. You didn't allow rejection to break you. You allowed it to rebuild you. And that kind of growth, that quiet, grounded, self-directed growth, carries more weight than silence ever could. If this message is speaking to you right now, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I truly value the conversations we build here together. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because this journey we're on, it's not about tactics, it's about transformation. There is something even deeper happening beneath all of this, and most people never fully see it until they've lived through it. When you move from silence into true emotional independence, you stop trying to be understood by someone who is no longer aligned with you. And that is not a small shift. That is a profound psychological release. Because so much of the pain you feel after disconnection isn't just about missing the person. It's about the desperate need to be seen correctly by them. You replay conversations in your mind. You think about what you should have said differently. You imagine moments where, if only they had understood your intention, things might have turned out differently. Even during no contact, part of you quietly hopes she will finally get it, that she will see your value, recognize your effort, and come back with clarity. But the moment you release the need to be understood by her, something inside you unlocks. It's subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but then you realize how much mental space you've reclaimed. You're no longer performing for an invisible audience. You're no longer shaping your growth around whether or not she might witness it. You stop posting things hoping she'll see. You stop imagining how she would react to your progress. You simply begin to live again, on your own terms. And this is where emotional self-containment becomes transformative instead of strategic. Because now, your actions are no longer driven by recognition. They're driven by alignment. And alignment feels different. It feels calm, it feels steady, it doesn't come with urgency or anxiety. It feels like making decisions that support your long-term peace instead of your short-term emotional relief. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this. How many decisions have you made in the past that were not actually about what was best for you, but about how they might be perceived by her? Maybe you stayed longer than you should have. Maybe you tolerated inconsistency. Maybe you ignored your intuition because you didn't want to lose the connection. That's not weakness, that's human attachment. But awareness of it is where your power begins. I remember speaking with a man who had been in a relationship for nearly a decade. He told me that toward the end, he felt like he was constantly adjusting himself to keep the peace. He would overthink his words, second-guess his reactions, and walk on emotional eggshells just to avoid conflict. And when the relationship ended, his first instinct was to go silent, hoping that his absence would make her realize what she lost. But after some time, he realized something much deeper. He said, "Mary, I don't think I even knew who I was in that relationship anymore." That realization is painful, but it's also incredibly liberating, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You begin to understand that the real work is not about getting her back, it's about getting yourself back. And as you begin to rebuild that relationship with yourself, your behavior starts to shift in ways that feel natural, not forced. You stop crafting subtle messages through social media. You stop trying to signal your growth. You stop performing strength. You simply become stronger. This is where Stoicism reveals its true depth. A Stoic man is not someone who feels nothing. He feels deeply. He experiences disappointment, attachment, nostalgia, even longing, but he does not allow those emotions to dictate his direction. He acknowledges them without becoming controlled by them, and that level of emotional discipline is rare. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires conscious effort and self-awareness. And here is what makes this so impactful in relationships. When she senses that you are no longer trying to prove yourself, no longer trying to be validated, no longer trying to be chosen, something shifts. Not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in a quiet, undeniable way. She feels that you are no longer placing her perception above your own self-concept. And that can be deeply disorienting for someone who once held emotional influence over you. Because attention is a form of energy. When you were emotionally invested, your attention flowed toward her, even in silence. But when you begin to withdraw that attention without resentment, without hostility, you are not punishing her. You are reallocating your energy. You are investing it back into yourself, your health, your purpose, your routines, your growth. And something interesting begins to happen as a result. You stop idealizing her, not because she was flawed or because you suddenly see her negatively, but because you begin to see yourself more clearly. Your life expands, and with that expansion comes perspective. The connection that once felt like everything begins to feel like a chapter, important, meaningful, but not all-defining. And this shift creates emotional stability. If she reaches out, you respond with calm curiosity instead of urgency. If she doesn't, you remain grounded. If she moves on, you don't spiral into self-doubt. If she hesitates, you don't chase for clarity. You are no longer anchored to her decisions, you are anchored to your own standards. And this is where we need to talk about something that many people avoid: dependency. Because dependency is what fuels most relationship anxiety. It's the underlying fear that your emotional well-being is tied to someone else's presence, attention, or validation. And when that dependency is challenged, it creates distress. It creates overthinking. It creates the urge to fix, to chase, to restore what feels like a loss of control. But when you become emotionally independent, that dependency begins to dissolve. You no longer need constant reassurance. You no longer interpret distance as rejection. You no longer scramble to regain connection at the cost of your dignity. Instead, you begin to operate from a place of self-respect. And here's the quiet truth that many don't realize. What often impacts someone more than silence is witnessing someone they once influenced become truly unaffected. Not cold, not distant in a harsh way, just steady, just grounded, just no longer dependent. Because when you are unaffected, you are no longer negotiating for love. You are no longer trying to earn it. You are simply open to receiving it when it aligns with your standards. And standards built from self-respect carry a different kind of weight. They are not loud, they are not demanding, but they are firm. This is the difference between playing a role and becoming someone who no longer needs to play one. There is a moment that happens quietly within you when this realization truly settles. It's the moment you stop asking, "How do I make her feel something?" and start asking, "Why was I willing to feel so little for myself?" That question can be confronting, but it's also incredibly empowering because it shifts your focus from external control to internal responsibility. When you obsess over strategies like no contact, delayed replies, or controlled indifference, you are still centering her emotions. You are still measuring your worth based on her reactions. But when you shift into emotional sovereignty, you begin to ask a different question. What is actually within my control? Her feelings are not. Her timing is not. Her clarity is not. But your character is. Your standards are. Your responses are. And when you fully internalize that, your behavior changes without force. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop defending your value. You stop negotiating for consistency. Instead, you observe. You pay attention to how someone shows up, not just what they say. You listen to patterns instead of promises. You notice how you feel in their presence, calm or anxious, respected or uncertain. This level of awareness is not detachment from emotion. It is maturity within emotion. And when you begin to operate from this place, you become grounded in a way that is rare. Not because others can't reach this level, but because few are willing to do the internal work required to get there. If this is resonating with you, take a moment and share in the comments what part of this is hitting you the most. Sometimes putting your thoughts into words is the first step toward clarity. And if you're finding value here, quietly subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because this journey is about more than understanding relationships. It's about understanding yourself. As you continue to grow in this way, something shifts in how you approach connection entirely. You begin to realize that chemistry alone is not enough. Attraction is easy. It's consistency that reveals character. And when you start valuing consistency over temporary emotion, your standards naturally rise. You are no longer impressed by intermittent attention. You are no longer swayed by mixed signals. You are no longer activated by uncertainty. Instead, you become selective. not in a rigid or closed-off way, but in a grounded, intentional way. And when a woman senses that you are no longer moved by temporary affection, that you are no longer chasing validation, she understands something important. She understands that you are operating from a higher internal standard. And standards do not beg. They do not chase. They either attract alignment or they walk away peacefully. That peaceful detachment is what creates the deepest psychological impact. Because it doesn't feel like a tactic. It feels like permanence. It feels like a shift that cannot be easily reversed. And when she realizes that you are not waiting for her to change, that you are not holding space in hopes of a different outcome, she is faced with her own clarity, not because you demanded it, but because your stability reflects it. And here is the part that surprises most men. This shift is not primarily about her reaction, it's about your nervous system. When you stop chasing emotional closure, your body begins to relax. Your sleep improves. Your thoughts become quieter. Your focus returns. You regain energy that was once consumed by overthinking and emotional tension. That internal calm is the real reward, and ironically, that calm is what creates the most powerful external impact. Because calm individuals cannot be emotionally manipulated. They cannot be baited into reactions. They cannot be destabilized by inconsistency. And when someone realizes they no longer have the power to disrupt your peace, they feel it, not always consciously, but deeply. And this is where everything begins to come together. The goal was never to make her miss you. The goal was to become someone who no longer abandons himself. Because when you stop abandoning yourself, everything changes. Your decisions become clearer. Your boundaries become stronger. Your presence becomes more grounded. And most importantly, your peace becomes yours again. The truth is, most people never realize how much of their emotional life is built around chasing closure. Not love, not connection, not even understanding, but closure. That feeling that everything makes sense again. That the story has a clean ending. That the questions finally stop echoing in your mind. And when someone pulls away, especially someone you cared about deeply, your instinct is to restore that sense of completion. You want to talk one more time, explain one more thing, hear one more reassurance that it wasn't all for nothing. But here's what changes everything. Closure is not something she gives you. It's something you create when you stop needing her to explain what she could not sustain. And I know that's not easy to hear, because a part of you still believes that if she just understood you better, if she just saw your intentions clearly, things would feel different. But real emotional growth begins when you accept that understanding is not a requirement for your peace. And I want you to think about this in your own life. How many times have you waited for someone to validate your experience before allowing yourself to move forward? How many times have you stayed emotionally stuck, not because the connection still existed, but because the explanation never came? That waiting, that quiet hoping, that is what keeps you tied, far more than silence ever could. There was a man I once spoke to who had been out of a relationship for nearly 2 years, and yet he still felt emotionally frozen. Not because he was still in contact, but because he never got the conversation he felt he deserved. He told me, "Mary, I just want to understand why she changed." And I asked him something simple, but it stayed with him. I said, "If she had the clarity to explain it, do you think she would have acted the way she did?" Sometimes the very behavior that hurt you is the explanation. And when you truly accept that, something inside you begins to release. You stop chasing answers that may never come. You stop reopening wounds in search of clarity. You begin to close the chapter, not with bitterness, but with understanding that not everything meaningful ends with explanation. This is where emotional independence deepens even further, because now you're no longer waiting for resolution. You are creating it. You are deciding that your peace is not dependent on someone else's ability to articulate their confusion, their inconsistency, or their limitations. And this shift does something incredibly powerful to your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who was left behind, and you begin to see yourself as someone who chose to move forward. That distinction matters more than you realize, because identity shapes behavior, and behavior shapes your future relationships. When you see yourself as someone who was abandoned, you operate from fear. You become hyper-aware, cautious, sometimes even guarded in ways that block genuine connection. But when you see yourself as someone who chose alignment over attachment, you operate from strength. You trust your decisions. You respect your boundaries. You move with intention instead of insecurity. Let me give you a very real example. A man in his early 50s came to me after ending a relationship that, on the surface, seemed full of chemistry. But beneath that chemistry was inconsistency. He told me, "Mary, when we were together, it felt incredible. But when we were apart, I felt anxious." And I asked him something that I want you to reflect on as well. I said, "Do you want a connection that feels good occasionally, or one that feels stable consistently?" Because those are not the same thing, and many people confuse intensity with compatibility. They think the emotional highs mean something deeper, when in reality, it's often the instability that creates those highs. The unpredictability, the uncertainty, the emotional roller coaster that keeps you engaged. But real connection, healthy connection, grounded connection, it doesn't feel like that. It feels calm, it feels steady, it feels safe. And when you begin to value that kind of connection, your entire perspective shifts. You stop chasing intensity. You start recognizing stability. You stop being drawn to what excites you temporarily. You start choosing what sustains you long-term. This is where your standards evolve in a very natural way. Not because you're trying to protect yourself, but because you've experienced what happens when you don't. You've felt the anxiety of inconsistency. You've lived through the confusion of mixed signals. And now, you're no longer willing to trade your peace for temporary emotional highs. And here's something important I want you to understand. When you reach this level of clarity, your energy changes. Not in a way that you can easily explain, but in a way that people can feel. You become more present, more grounded, less reactive. You don't rush into conversations. You don't chase attention. You don't overinvest early. And that creates a different kind of attraction. Not the anxious, urgent, I need to win you over kind of attraction, but a calm, steady, I am open, but I am not dependent kind of presence. And that presence does something powerful. It filters out what is not aligned. Because people who are used to inconsistency often struggle with stability. They may be drawn to it, but they don't always know how to meet it. And that's okay. Because your role is not to adjust your standard to fit someone else's limitations. Your role is to maintain your standard and allow the right person to meet it. This is where many men go wrong. They believe that if they just try a little harder, communicate a little better, show a little more patience, they can make the connection work. But relationships are not built on effort alone. They are built on mutual alignment. You cannot carry a connection on your own. And the moment you truly accept that, you stop overextending yourself. You stop giving more than what is being reciprocated. You stop trying to prove your worth through consistency when the other person is inconsistent. Instead, you begin to mirror reality. If the effort is mutual, you invest. If it's not, you step back. Not as a tactic, but as a reflection of your standard. And that is what emotional maturity looks like. It's not about being distant. It's not about being cold. It's about being clear. Clear about what you value. Clear about what you tolerate. Clear about what you are willing to accept in your life. And clarity creates confidence. Not the loud, performative kind of confidence, but the quiet, grounded kind. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that doesn't seek approval. The kind that simply knows. And when you move through the world with that kind of presence, something interesting happens. You stop attracting situations that require you to abandon yourself because you no longer participate in them. You notice red flags earlier. You trust your intuition more. You walk away sooner when something doesn't feel right. And you do it without drama, without resentment, without needing the other person to agree with your decision. That is emotional independence. And I want to pause here for a moment because if you've been following this closely, you might be realizing something about yourself. Maybe you're recognizing patterns you didn't see before. Maybe you're connecting dots from past relationships. Maybe you're starting to understand why certain dynamics kept repeating in your life. That awareness, that is where real change begins. If this is hitting home for you, take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part of this you're starting to see more clearly, because sometimes speaking your truth is the first step toward living it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, not just for more content, but for continued growth. As you continue on this path, something even deeper begins to settle within you. You stop fearing loss in the same way, not because you don't value connection, but because you value yourself more. You understand that the right relationship will not require you to shrink, to chase, or to constantly question where you stand. And that understanding changes how you show up. You become more intentional, more patient, more selective. You take your time getting to know someone. You pay attention to how they handle consistency, communication, and respect. You observe how they show up over time, not just how they present themselves in moments of excitement. Because you've learned something important. Anyone can show interest. Not everyone can show consistency. And consistency is what builds trust. It's what creates emotional safety. It's what allows a connection to grow in a healthy, sustainable way. So now, instead of asking, "Do they like me?" you begin to ask, "Do they show up in a way that aligns with what I need?" And that question shifts your entire focus, from being chosen to choosing. And when you become the one who chooses, you take your power back. Not in a controlling way, not in a manipulative way, but in a grounded, self-respecting way. You are no longer waiting to be validated. You are evaluating. You are no longer chasing connection. You are assessing alignment. And that is a completely different way of living. And this is where transformation becomes visible, not just to others, but to yourself. Because when you operate from emotional independence, you notice a profound internal shift. You no longer experience the gut-twisting anxiety of wondering if someone will reach out. You don't replay conversations endlessly in your mind. You aren't tethered to their timing, their clarity, or their approval. Your emotional energy is no longer spent trying to pull someone toward you. It's focused entirely on maintaining your own equilibrium and cultivating your own life. Many men are surprised to find that this kind of freedom doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels full. You begin to reclaim the hours, the thoughts, the attention that were once consumed by anticipation and reaction. You start investing in your health, your purpose, your friendships, your passions. You start waking up with intention rather than with a sense of lack. And here's the key. Your actions now come from alignment, not from reaction. Every choice you make reinforces your self-respect, and every choice you make strengthens your internal compass. And as you anchor yourself in this way, your presence becomes magnetic, not because you are trying to be noticed, but because you are no longer operating from need. People sense it. Women sense it. It's not the loud, performative attraction of drama or tension. It's the quiet draw of stability, of grounded confidence, of a man who has made himself whole before inviting anyone else in. There's a story I often share with my viewers. A man in his 50s had been obsessively tracking a past relationship, analyzing every interaction, every text, every nuance of behavior. He told me he felt trapped, unable to move forward. I asked him to experiment. Instead of trying to monitor or manipulate the outcome, he would devote his energy to rebuilding himself. His routine, his passions, his friendships, without any agenda toward her. He hesitated at first, but then he committed. Within weeks, something remarkable happened. The sense of anxiety and obsession lifted. The pull that had kept him entangled in the past dissolved. And the most surprising part, the relationship no longer mattered in the same way, not because it was insignificant, but because he had reclaimed himself. He was free. Freedom like that cannot be faked. It cannot be simulated through tactics or strategies. It is born from emotional sovereignty. And here's what I want you to understand. Emotional sovereignty is the ultimate attraction, the ultimate power, and the ultimate peace. When a man achieves this, he no longer responds to uncertainty with chasing or pleading. He no longer measures his worth by someone else's attention. He simply exists from a place of grounded alignment. And let me be clear, this is not coldness, indifference, or detachment from humanity. You still feel deeply, still love, still care. But you no longer allow your sense of self to be dictated by inconsistency or lack of reciprocation. You operate from choice rather than compulsion. You respond rather than react. You observe rather than chase. And that shift is profound. There's a psychological principle at play here. Human beings are wired to detect emotional availability, not just words. If your attention, your energy, your emotions are freely given but contingent upon someone else's behavior, it creates a subtle tension and attachment. But if your attention is consistent and grounded in your own self-respect, it creates a stable, irresistible presence. People feel it, even if they can't articulate it, and the emotional impact is deeper and more lasting than any fleeting silence ever could. When you embrace this level of emotional independence, you also begin to see your past relationships differently. You no longer view them as failures or losses, but as lessons and mirrors. Each interaction, each heartbreak, each unresolved story becomes part of your growth. You recognize patterns, you see where you may have ceded power, and you make conscious choices not to repeat those behaviors. You develop discernment, the ability to assess who is aligned with your values, your standards, and your rhythm without ego or resentment clouding your judgment. And here's the most empowering realization. The moment you stop trying to provoke a reaction, to get closure, or to be seen in a certain way, you reclaim enormous psychological power. You begin to shape your life on your terms. You are no longer reactive. You are not tethered to outcomes. You are self-directed. And that sense of freedom radiates outward, affecting every interaction, every decision, every connection you choose to engage in. If she reaches out, you respond calmly, evaluating patterns over promises. If she doesn't, you remain steady, unshaken, and unbothered. If new connections come into your life, you meet them with clarity, not desperation. And through all of this, you cultivate something rare: consistency of self, integrity of action, and peace of mind. This is what it truly means to move from silence as a strategy to emotional sovereignty as a way of life. The man who masters this does not manipulate, does not play games, and does not need to control outcomes. He simply chooses alignment, maintains boundaries, and invests in his own growth and well-being. That is where true power resides, not in causing someone to miss you, but in being someone who no longer abandons himself. And here's the final truth I want you to carry with you. The world will never fully recognize the internal work you do. People may never see your discipline, your calm, or your resilience. They may not understand the depth of your emotional independence. And that is perfectly fine, because this journey is not about approval or recognition. It is about self-mastery, integrity, and living in alignment with your own values. When you reach this level, freedom becomes your constant companion. Freedom from chasing, freedom from proving, freedom from needing validation, freedom from hoping someone else will provide clarity you already hold within yourself. And freedom, grounded in self-respect and emotional maturity, will always carry far more weight than any tactic, any silence, or any strategic withdrawal ever could. So, as you continue to practice this in your own life, remember this: the path to emotional sovereignty is a journey, not a destination. Each day, each choice, each decision to prioritize yourself over reaction strengthens your foundation. Each time you respond from alignment rather than compulsion, you reinforce your internal power. And slowly but surely, you become the man who is truly free. Free to love without fear, free to connect without anxiety, free to live without being tethered to outcomes beyond your control. Take a deep breath and let that sink in. You've carried so much, observed so deeply, and now you have the tools to live from a place of calm, centered power. And if you found value in this discussion, like the video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to continue growing with us here on Mindful Senior Living. This is about more than relationships. It's about building a life anchored in clarity, self-respect, and emotional freedom.